Good afternoon and welcome to the third instalment of At Home with ERM and KJA webinar series. My name is Ollie Moore and I'm a partner at ERM. The current global climate under COVID-19 restrictions is challenging us to move swiftly and adapt even faster. To support you and your organisation to continue to move forward, maintain delivery and even innovate during these times, we've curated a set of topics in this webinar series that we hope will spark thought, insight and learning. We look forward to you joining each of our webinars over the coming weeks. We'll have details on those at the end of this session, and invitations for the registration will be sent shortly thereafter. This webinar, update on planning approvals for major projects in New South Wales and Victoria, including the revisions to the triggers for the Independent Planning Commission in New South Wales, is a timely session given that just today the New South Wales Minister for Planning announced further changes to the IPC, and we've included these in the session. It's presented by David Snashall, Amanda Antcliff and Jon Brock, and will draw on the experience of our KJA colleagues Darryl, Watkins and Paula Lawrence to comment on the levers of government in both states. Combined, these presenters bring many years of experience, both in preparing and submitting applications for major projects and with the inside working of ministerial offices and government agencies. Before we start, I'd like to make a brief acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet today. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Before we hand over to our presenters, our facilitator for today, Raquel Boyd, will take us through how to use the GoToWebinar platform. Raquel, over to you.
Thanks so much, Ollie. In front of you, you can see a little diagram of the control panel that hopefully you can all see as you're watching the GoToWebinar today. So just to give you a brief overview of how to interact through this software, let's have a look at what these icons can do for us. Now, firstly, if we look at the first one, that's your microphone. And for everyone on the call, you are automatically muted, so it is showing red. I will also point out at this point in time that we are recording this session as well, so please note that. The bottom icon on your control panel, or depending on how you've got your screen configured, it might be elsewhere on that control panel, but it is a question mark. And if you click on that, you'll have the opportunity to type in a question. Now, please feel free to type in your question at any time through the session. We do have an open Q&A discussion period allocated at the end of the session today. So we will go to it then. If we can answer it through the session, we'll also do that as well. So keep an eye on that icon if it flashes up to let you know that there's an answer for you. The third icon is the hand icon. Now, we'll be using this again in that session at the end, where we're certainly inviting you to ask questions and comment. If you would like to do that at that point in time, please raise your hand, and you can do that by clicking on that icon. If you do raise your hand and we come to you to speak, I'll be able to unmute your line from the control panel on my side, and then you'll be able to ask your question openly in the webinar. All right, with no further ado, David, over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Snashall. I'm a partner in the Sydney office of ERM. I've been a partner there for many, many years, and many of you I have met over the time. I'm just turning on my webcam to introduce myself, and I'll turn it off shortly as we move through the presentation. Look, there's two main things we're going to talk about today. The first one is how the planning systems in both New South Wales and Victoria are adjusting themselves to this COVID situation, and in particular, how the governments are seeking to use the planning systems to generate economic growth by kickstarting major projects. I'm going to talk about New South Wales. Then I'm going to pass to my colleague, Jon Brock, who will talk about Victoria. Then we're going to draw on our colleagues, Darryl and Paula from KJA, both of who've had many years of experience in ministerial offices, to talk about what would be happening inside government and to provide some tips from their long experience. After that, Amanda Antcliff is going to talk about the changes to the New South Wales Independent Planning Commission. Some important changes were slipped out last month, and today there's also been another set of changes, and showing our agility, we've grabbed those and slotted those into our presentation today. So I'll just turn off my webcam and head into the topic. We've got a fair bit of material to cover, and so we'll probably go through at something of a canter to try and make the most of our 45 minutes. In New South Wales, the government's objective is to create 30,000 construction jobs over the next 6 months, and it's taken a range of measures in the planning system to help with the COVID situation. A bunch of these are minor issues. They've done things like increase the hours you're allowed to work on construction sites. They've taken away constraints on deliveries to major supermarkets and shopping centres so that we can all get our toilet paper on time and things like that. I'm going to focus mostly on what they're doing around major projects. They've set up a program to fast track major project DAs, and I'm going to talk about that. The Minister in his press release also mentioned a one-stop shop for projects which, in the Minister's words, were stuck in the system. They're also talking about clearing the backlog to the Land and Environment Court by appointing additional commissioners, and a range of other issues in terms of supporting councils on DA processing and some targeted infrastructure investment in northwestern Sydney. The Planning System Acceleration Project, nothing like a good name and acronym for government, is administered by the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, or DPIE, as we all probably fondly know it. And the program is all about getting projects shovel ready so they move into construction quickly. It's focused on two types of project or proposal. The first is major development applications, including state significant development, state significant infrastructure, critical state infrastructure. And it's targeting those projects which can commence construction within 6 months of approval from the department. Secondly, it's targeting major planning proposals, rezonings, site suitability certificates, and in that arena, it's looking for projects which can go into DA within 6 months of approval. The diagram on the right there is taken from the department's website and just shows the way the system works. But importantly, it's picking on projects which are already inside the system and projects which have already been through their public exhibition stage. Now, at the end of April, the Minister, in announcing this, announced the first 24 projects, and there was a range of projects. There was a number of education projects, including School Infrastructure New South Wales projects, some university projects, some university housing projects. There was a number of big urban development projects, which were creating a lot of housing, a couple of medium-sized waste projects, and probably the flagship project in amongst the 24 is the Snowy 2.0 project, value 4.6 billion, according to the press release, intended to create 2,000 jobs. Now, this list of projects was announced on the 28th of April, and the department has said these projects will be approved by the 21st of May. So approval within a space of 4 weeks. Interestingly, and importantly probably for all of you, is that there are further tranches to follow. This program is intended to last 6 months. The next tranche of projects, tranche 2, is intended to come out when the tranche 1 projects have achieved approval. Each tranche is intended to come out with a 4-week approval timeframe. So if you can get your project into a tranche, you might be able to hasten your process through the latter part of the approvals system. You may well be asking, how are these projects selected? Well, the department has published a paper, and we will circulate this presentation to attendees after the call. And I've got links to all of these key documents at the end of the PowerPoint. But it's called the Priority Projects Criteria. It's about 12 pages, and it goes through in reasonable detail about the criteria. Summarising them down, there are 3 key criteria. There are jobs. How many jobs will the project create, both in its construction and in its operational phase? The paper does go into some detail about how the department will calculate that number of jobs in making that assessment. Sometimes they will rely on the applicant, sometimes they will use their own economic models. Timing, which I've already mentioned, they will be seeking projects that can meet those timeframes. And finally, public benefit. And there's quite a range of public benefit subcategories, I guess, which are discussed in the paper, including infrastructure, housing, particularly a focus on social housing, public and urban spaces, and also a category called strategic merit, which talks about projects which meet other government objectives. So there's a paper there and it sets out the criteria. You probably may well then next be asking, saying, this is great, anything to speed out our approval. How do I get on the project? How do I get on the list? And the picture here is one of the schools. I think this is the Meadowbank Educational Precinct, which is on the Tranche 1 list. Okay, well, the first thing is you need to demonstrate your project meets the program criteria. I mean, the system has been set up. The system has been run past ICAC, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and a probity advisor has been appointed. So there's governance around this system. It's not a pat on the back type system. You'll need to, so first of all, to make it easy for the department, you should demonstrate your project really clearly meets the program criteria. You should also position the project amongst a range of other government objectives, strategic plans, other priorities. You know, it just helps to sell the project. And then interestingly, you should check in with what's called a peak stakeholder organisation, such as the Property Council, the Urban Taskforce, the UDIA, or the Housing Industry Association. The government's paper, the priority projects criteria, notes that the peak stakeholder organisations were consulted on developing the criteria, and it seems that there's an ongoing working task force with between the department and these peak stakeholders. So they've got a bit of a say in this process, an understanding of the process, and so it's worthwhile if you're a member of one of those to use that membership to your advantage. It would also be advantageous if you could demonstrate support for your project, such as from the local council. And then it's a process, frankly, of nominating the project directly to the Department of Planning. I have the email of the person who is receiving the nominations. I decided best not to publish it, but if you want to get it, then perhaps you could contact me afterwards. So that's I think my last slide. And I'll now hand over. Is that my last slide, Amanda? And yes, and I'll hand over to my colleague Jon, partner in our Melbourne office, to talk about what's happening in Victoria. Thanks, Jon.
Thanks a lot, David, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the seminar. And my name is Jon Brock. I'm a planning partner at ERM, based in the Melbourne office, and have had a Victorian experience the whole of my planning career. So what's happening in Victoria? Pretty much summed up as same but different when you compare it to New South Wales. Very much the same objectives, general criteria, but there is a different implementation approach, and that's what I want to focus on today, particularly with respect to those matters regarding major development approvals. So the three that I intend to focus on today: the Omnibus Bill, Building Victoria's Recovery Task Force, and Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, or VCAT as we know it down here in Victoria. So I'll just turn off my webcam now so you can look at some pretty pictures. Okay, the Omnibus Bill. This is primarily a procedural initiative. It's temporary for 6 months and affects probably over 30 statutes across the Victorian governance system. In terms of major developments we're talking about today, the Planning Environment Act and the Local Government Act are the two that are most relevant to us. And the purpose of these changes in the Omnibus Bill is to ensure continuation of the delivery of services, decision making, and keeping the system operational. The key to the whole situation is that it's enabling the use of remote technology, such as Zoom or the GoToWebinar we're on today, to enable people to still interact. At the moment, under various legislative acts, things like Planning Panels Victoria, they must hold hearings in public. The Omnibus Bill enables that to be now held electronically across webinars and so forth. And the whole purpose is to keep the business running, the council meeting procedures, council meetings, to enable decisions to be made. I'll now turn to probably the major initiative that the government's introduced, and that's Building Victoria's Recovery Task Force. So that commenced on the 24th of April, similar timeframe to New South Wales. It's overseen by the Planning Minister and Treasurer and will be set up for an initial period of 3 months. After that period, there will be a review with the Planning Minister and Treasurer to determine how successful it's been. And we would hope that that would continue beyond that. Again, similar to New South Wales, it's about identifying shovel-ready projects and provide a pathway formally to facilitate expedient approvals. When the Minister announced the initiative, he automatically approved 4 new projects that had been in the system for quite some time. The combined value of those is $1.5 billion. So you can see that they're very much major developments. And you'll see on the right-hand side there, what's going to be the newest or the largest residential tower in Australia, the Beulah South Bank development. That was one of the projects that was approved. In the following slides, you'll see the other projects which we'll now get into. So the task force initially has been set up just to oversee decisions delayed due to COVID-19. It focuses on applications that are already in the system and ready for planning approval, and they must commence within 12 months, so very much shovel ready. Initially, the task force is looking at projects over $100 million, so again, very significant. But there is an opportunity for people to apply to get on the task force agenda, but they must meet the priority project criteria, which we'll now step through. In terms of that process, and you'll see Flemington on the right-hand side of that picture there, projects will be triaged by the task force, and the task force is made up by senior people within state government, primarily well-renowned, well-respected planning professionals and people within the building construction industry. The first thing to get across the line is to demonstrate that the project warrants ministerial intervention, which there's a number of issues there I've highlighted on the slide with respect to complying with government policy being quite significant either in a state or regional perspective, being properly funded and shovel ready, deliver public value, and there is a focus around public and social housing and project diversity. It doesn't impact on current planning objectives in the planning scheme, and also you need to demonstrate the decision has been unreasonably delayed. What's that criteria? There's 7 criteria that the task force will go through, and I don't intend to go through each of these today, and as David said, we do have a link to these documents later on, but certainly in terms of making application, there is an application form that's been produced. It is very complex, not only outlines the details of the project you're putting forward and the state that, well, the position where that is in the planning queue at the moment, but there is a section, a confidential section, I must admit, that needs to be completed, which is very, very complex and covers a lot of issues in terms of project readiness. And to name a few of those, you need to demonstrate what the impact of COVID-19 has been, provide financial reports of your business, project ownership structure of the project valuation reports, bank feasibility studies, funding strategies, construction contracts, and an economic impact study. So you can very much see there that whilst it's opening up the door for fast-tracking major developments, you do need to be ready and prepared to build and construct, because it's not just focused on the planning system, it's also focused very much on building and construction sector, very similar to the New South Wales situation. So that's in a nutshell the task force. The other element which is slightly related but is significant is VCAT, which is our like the Land Environment Court in New South Wales. They've been given $5.2 million to proceed from the paper ages of the past to the new world of digitisation. So at the moment, 400 cases have been on hold during COVID. And the importance in terms of major projects to note is that they're included within that hold. So there's a number of major projects that have been held up simply because VCAT has not been prepared and been in a position to digitise its systems, still working on old paper systems. So I think that, along with the other initiatives, is significant and worth mentioning today. So where does this all lead us to, and what it is? Well, I'd like to think this is the future is now, as I've put there. Very much that there is and I've joined a number of different webinars from the task force and others, VPLA and other institutions, that everyone sees this as a great time to trial initiatives or thoughts that have often been in the system for quite some time, but there hasn't been a will to put your foot in the water to try and test them out. So very clear comments made from state government personnel that if the initiatives are proven to be successful, they'll be put in place permanently. I think we'll see priority projects as an issue that's embedded within the system forever and a day, I would hope. And I think that's certainly something that's been missing in Victoria. And the whole thing is about underpinning improved planning assessments. I mentioned before the omnibus bill, that different ways of doing business. We don't always have to go to a council meeting on a Monday night or a Tuesday night. It's something that can be done differently, and we'd like to see that. Me personally, I would like to see and hope that the task force criteria that we currently have is eased up a little bit. I think as they go through the next 3 months, there will be some consideration of that, but hopefully that will unlock doors for other projects and enable us to move forward. So again, as Dave mentioned, I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this session. We've got some time allocated there, but for the time being, I'll pass over to Darryl Watkins and Paul Lawrence from KGA to talk through their experiences in government. Over to you, Darryl and Paula.
Hi, everyone. My name's Paula Lawrence. I'm the Program Director for KGA in Victoria. Darryl and I, who you'll meet shortly, he and I go way back. We were both in government at the same time during the GFC. I was the Chief of Staff with the government for almost 4 years across portfolios for tourism, housing, Aboriginal housing, roads, and assisting on regional development. While we're waiting for Darryl, the image that you can see there, some of you in New South Wales will know, others may not. That's quite a famous tree for staffers and for journalists in New South Wales. It's what's called the Tree of Truth, and it's out the back of New South Wales Parliament House, and it's where ministers, opposition and government quite often goes to make announcements. So I thought while Darryl and I were sharing our insights today, it might be a handy image to have. Darryl, are you ready to rock and roll?
My name's Darryl Watkins. I'm a partner at ERM and KJA. In a previous life, I've been a Deputy Chief of Staff for the New South Wales Government, for a Minister and a Premier, and also Chief of Staff for a Federal Minister. The reason I want to just give you a bit of an update is the economic downturn associated with the current COVID scenario is similar to the situation that we're encountering now. It was the global financial crisis in 2008. At the time, I was Deputy Chief of Staff for the New South Wales Minister for Planning, and the government's priority was very similar to the current situation at present, is stimulating the economic activity. We needed to tweak the planning system to deliver projects and jobs and stimulate the economy. It was an exciting time, and working collaboratively in partnership with the Department of Planning to deliver for the state was a highlight. Now, because I cut out with my connection, I just need to understand whether, Paula, can I hand over to you now?
Darryl, I've done my quick introduction, so you can move on to the next section of your presentation.
Thanks, Paula. From a personal perspective, I think the announcement from the Minister is a good one. The Minister's doing a decent job, and it is sensible and practical. The Minister has set the guidelines, but the Minister and his office are completely hands-off in terms of processing, as David mentioned, and leaving the decisions entirely to the department. It is clear in the criteria that the intent of the announcement is not about circumventing the system, but fast-tracking projects. The criteria must be met for any project to be considered, and allocating a probity advisor to the process is a good initiative. The Minister's office and the Minister will want to avoid the slightest risk of being seen to politically interfere with the process. So over to you, Paula, to talk about what's happening in Victoria regarding process and departmental minister approval.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Darryl. Well, as Jon outlined before, Victoria has enacted a range of measures. We've also seen an emergency cabinet created, and senior bureaucrats are being moved to other portfolios and different roles within portfolios to support stimulus works and the rapid backfilling of former roles. We also understand that departments have been asked to identify a range of fast-track projects that will be brought forward to support stimulus efforts. Across the state government, we're seeing significant pressure to deliver and people in unfamiliar roles. In this environment, it's going to be incredibly important to ensure that your projects and proposals clearly meet the government's expectations and criteria. The simpler you can make that process for those assessing an application, the more likely a project will be moved forward. Victorian government is also highly sensitive to delays and complications on projects. The Westgate Tunnel project is case in point, with delays and highly visible complications now pushing completion on that project out by 12 months to 2023. In this environment, the government's seeking certainty that deadlines and outcomes will be met and that the project will be received favourably by the community.
If you have projects being considered in Tranche 1 and maybe for Tranche 2 in New South Wales, or some may think that your project should get a green light, then I recommend the following and some practical hints when dealing with the New South Wales bureaucracy. My strong advice is be creative and think outside the square on how your project can benefit the economy and the community. One suggestion would be for projects to, of course, deliver against the criteria as mentioned earlier, but to also look at the government's COVID's initiatives, their regional plans, the Premier's priorities, and see how your project might deliver against those to stand out. For example, in New South Wales, nearly 100,000 people have enrolled in free TAFE courses in the past 2 months. Could the project you wish to put forward, could you coordinate with TAFE to give some students work placement? So what I'm trying to say here is be creative to ensure your project stands out amongst the others. From my experience, you may have the best EIS, but the minister or decision maker will always ask the political advisor, what does the community think about this project? And that's very important for the decision maker to see where the political bites may be. Think about social procurement guidelines and Indigenous employment for your projects, because they resonate well amongst the elected officials and also the bureaucracy. Ensure you have a solid EIS and you have good communication to support your project, like a project narrative to really sell your key message. Also a reminder that the assessments still need to pass all hurdles, and one of those is the important part of the community engagement. Again, the minister will not want this process to be seen to be riding roughshod over the community. Hence, you need smart, innovative community engagement and a risk analysis lens on your project. Further, have in the back of your mind that the New South Wales bureaucrats are very busy people, especially in times of crisis. If you can make their life easier and do more than just ticking the boxes, then that will hold you in good stead. If you can give them the tools and messaging to sell your project internally and to the minister's office, then you have every chance of your project being a winner. Don't think just having a coffee with a staffer will give you the green light for your project. In terms of project discussions, negotiations and acceptance of the project is entirely left to the department. And in closing, the New South Wales Premier has also shifted her language in the past week. The key priority no longer is flattening the curve and is purely health focused. It is now more about the economy and jobs while keeping people safe. So there is a good message in that projects with jobs will be a priority. So thank you for your time, and I will now hand over to Paula for her closing comments.
Thanks, Darryl. I think it's fair to say in Victoria, we're all waiting for some major government announcements and a further reduction in the COVID restrictions. However, through the establishment of the Building Victoria's Recovery Taskforce, led by the Minister for Planning and Housing and the Treasurer, the government in this state has declared that it will be a construction-led recovery in Victoria. This creates the ideal environment to bring forward projects in this state. I'd now like to hand over to Amanda Antcliff. Amanda is a principal planner with ERM. She's been with the company for 12 years and has more than 18 years experience in planning in New South Wales. Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, Paula. So I'm going to focus on the recent changes to the Independent Planning Commission triggers, which have been made following a recent review of the Commission. So the New South Wales Independent Planning Commission was established in 2018. It's a decision maker for the most significant and contentious development applications in the state. It's fair to say that the level of interest in and scrutiny of planning decisions has increased dramatically as the community has become more engaged, and particularly in relation to land use conflicts. And there's also a range of emerging complex issues that present challenges, particularly around climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, including Scope 3 emissions. And the IPC, as a decision maker, has been the subject of increasing scrutiny and criticism. So in October 2019, the New South Wales Minister for Planning and Public Spaces requested the New South Wales Productivity Commission to undertake a review of the IPC's role and operations. It kind of came on the back of a number of highly controversial developments that were referred to the IPC in 2019, including the Bylong Valley underground and open cut coal mine that was refused in September, and the Star Casino Tower, which the IPC eventually rejected in November of 2019. So the Productivity Commission's review report was handed to government in December last year, and in February this year, the Minister announced that the New South Wales government had accepted the review's recommendations. So overall, the review made 12 recommendations, the principal finding being that the IPC should be retained as an independent decision-making body for contentious state significant developments. And there are another 11 recommendations that were primarily aimed at addressing the time frame, consistency, clarity, and integrity of the processes. One of the, I guess, the key areas that the Productivity Commission's review focused on, and which has clearly been a bit of a issue for the developers in the community, is the thresholds which trigger referral to the IPC. Before the review, the thresholds as defined in the legislation were that if you had more than 25 or more public objections to an application, or the local council had objected, or the applicant had made a reportable political donation declaration, those projects were referred to the IPC. The Commission noted that there was a lot of stakeholder concerns regarding those thresholds, particularly the 25 or more public objections, and concern around the cost and delays to projects resulting from IPC referral. So as you can see, just in the graph on the slide at the moment, over the last few years, there's been a clear increase in the number of cases which triggered the IPC based on the 25 or more public objections, whereas over the same period of time, there was a decrease in the number of projects that triggered it on the basis of the council objection or the reportable political donation. I guess other key concerns that was picked up in the Productivity Commission and generally within the development community is that with the 25 public objection trigger, there's a lot of gaming of the system or drumming up of those objections within the community, particularly within community organisations, and therefore concerns regarding whether such objections actually are genuinely in the local public interest. So the recommendations that came out of the Productivity Commission resulted in changes to the State and Regional Development SEP, and these changes were gazetted on the 16th of March this year. The changes, the key changes are that the community objection trigger has been raised to 50, whereas before it was 25. The local council objection trigger is still in there, but there are provisions that if the council does rescind that objection following the exhibition period, and where the council objection was the only trigger for the IPC, those SSD applications would actually then be delegated back to the department in those circumstances. The changes to the legislation also mean that the Commission will be the consent authority for modification applications only in the event where there's been a reportable political donations. All other modification applications will now be delegated back to the department for determination. It's noteworthy that the legislation also specifically says that these changes to these thresholds do apply to applications that are currently in the system and that have not yet been determined, and where they haven't been referred to the IPC already. It's interesting, one of the key points within the Productivity Commission's review, there was a lot of discussion around a distance potentially being applied to objectors relating to that 50 trigger. The report talks to a 100-kilometre radius, but we note that those changes have not been adopted in the legislative changes. So I guess based on these changes, there's two key changes, I guess, that are of great interest. One being the increase from 25 to 50 objections, which I've just spoke to. The other one is how the legislation deals with petitions and pro forma letters. As many of you would know, petitions and pro forma letters often organised by community organisations, easily result in projects being referred to the IPC. So a new clause has been added to the SEP where submissions by way of a petition or a pro forma letter, where the legislation specifically says the same or substantially the same text, those submissions will be deemed under the legislation to be one submission. But I guess the key question then is, what does substantially the same text mean? And how will the Department of Planning interpret this when they go through and categorise the submissions following exhibition? So this is all new, and there's very little, if no example, of how the Department of Planning will be applying this. However, we actually have a current project that we're working on with a client that is shedding light on how the department will approach the same or substantially the same text process. This project that we're working on came off public exhibition at the end of February this year. For that project, we received 91 public objections, of which 64 were pro forma letters or modified pro forma letters. And what I mean by modified pro forma letters is that it's a pro forma letter where the person may have mixed around the words or the paragraphs, added an additional sentence or added an additional paragraph, or slightly modified the text. Now, in this case, that pro forma letter was actually created by a community organisation group who encouraged the community to submit objections using the pro forma publicly on their website. So we've had discussions with the department relating to how the same or substantially the same text clause will be applied in this case. And they've indicated that for a modified pro forma letter to be counted as an individual or unique submission, it would need to raise a new issue above that that's already been raised in the pro forma. If no new issue is raised, it would deem to be a pro forma and therefore would not count as an individual or unique submission. So on that basis, for this project, as a result, we're looking at around 40 unique submissions now, inclusive of unique individual submissions and those modified pro formas that are deemed to have raised new issues. And this means that the project is not anticipated now to trigger the IPC. Had the thresholds not changed, or the same or substantially the same text had not been included, the project would most certainly have triggered the IPC. So, these changes have saved the project probably around 6 months associated with IPC referral and assessment process. So now I'll just very, very quickly touch on the changes that were announced only this morning by the Minister. So he's released a statement that says that with the IPC, there's a statement of expectations that have been created that outlines timeframes and processes for the IPC. The key ones being that the IPC will be expected to determine applications within a certain period of time, being the first one being a determination within 5 weeks for projects that don't require a public meeting or public hearing, 8 weeks for projects that are subject to a public meeting, and 12 weeks for projects that are subject to a public hearing, and that any advice that the IPC gives to the Planning Secretary regarding gateway or rezoning reviews are required in 5 weeks. And that process will be wrapped up in a memorandum of understanding between the department and the IPC, and includes a probity process and guidelines for provision of additional information, etc. So I'll throw back to David now quickly, just mindful of time. David, did you have any further comments before we go into Q&A?
No, I don't. Thank you, Amanda. I think we should head into Q&A. We've run a bit over time.
Great, thanks everyone. So look, now is the time to raise your hand if you have a question, pop it up. I would also encourage you to use the questions box. We have a couple of questions that are coming in at the moment, which maybe are quite complex and could probably take a bit of time to ask and a bit of time to answer. So if you do have any questions that you would like us to actually follow up with you after the session, please feel free, type those into your questions box, and we will absolutely come back to you to address those and have a conversation with you about it. But if you do have anything that you'd particularly like to just ask now at this juncture, raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon, and we'll be able to unmute you so that you can ask your question into the session. Okay, looks like we've got no one's popping their hand up, which is totally fine. I think that the team have done a great job of certainly addressing probably a lot of questions before they were asked. Oh, we do have one now. I'm just going to unmute you, Sarah, so that you can ask your question to the panel.
Thanks, Raquel. Sarah Wilson here from KJA. I was just wondering if perhaps you could answer the question about the one-stop shop process for projects that are stuck in the system. How does that actually work?
Look, I'll start on that, but Darryl, I'd ask you to come in and provide your experience as well. Sarah, it's fair to say very few details of that have come out, and I'm kind of intrigued with that because the Minister said it's a one-stop shop for projects stuck in the system. And when projects are stuck between government agencies, and these projects all go in to the Department of Planning for approval, but often they then have the Department of Planning is reliant on advice from the EPA and other agencies. It can become something of a standoff, and projects get stuck in between. And the Department of Planning is not willing to push their colleagues in the other department, say the EPA, to come through with a clear conclusion and recommendation. So that's what the one-stop shop needs to do. Darryl, what's your experience with this kind of one-stop shop process?
Yeah, thanks, David. What tends to happen, from my understanding, especially in this case, is that the policy there's quite a few policy staff within the department, and they would be redirected through to the assessment section, and then they would work with other government agencies in regards to certain regulations that, as you suggested, the EPA would have some certain regulations that the project needs to abide by. Then they would work with that department, those assessment people, to try and fast track it. One thing that they did when I was, the department did when I was in government, was they assigned project managers to certain projects to assist in the fast tracking, and these were people who were trained planners. So that's all I can really offer here. It's about redirecting the resources, and the priority for the government will be to stimulate the economy and the jobs, and then with that would become using the available resources within the department, and at times they may reallocate others, but I haven't got that detail.
Thanks.
Raquel. Thanks, David. Thanks, Darryl. So we do have an opportunity, I think, for one more question in the audio. If anyone has one, if you would like to raise your hand, very happy for you to ask your question of the panel at this time. Okay. Well, look, team, you've done a fantastic job, certainly, of addressing so much detail and content in this session. Thank you very much for that. And certainly for all the attendees, if you do have any questions you'd like to type in as we're finishing up this session, please feel free to do so. And of course, you can contact any of us at any time for further questions. Now, I'll just pass back to you, Ollie, for the closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Raquel, and thank you, team. Obviously, there was a lot of content in that session, and we didn't have an awful lot of time for questions. So please do reach out to us if you have any questions, or fill out those questions in the available in the GoToWebinar system. There was a lot of content. What hopefully it brought across there was the benefit that the combination of the technical experience, the stakeholder engagement that KJA bring, and the government experience combined together, and ERM and KJA together are able to help you navigate the regulatory framework and approvals framework. So hopefully that came across. I thought it was an excellent presentation, so thank you very much to the panel. For those of you still on the call, hopefully you can join our upcoming webinars over the next couple of weeks. We've got the next week's is Stakeholders Matter and Their Impact Decisions, so a very timely and particularly interesting session. And then following that, on the 28th of May, we've got a session on environmental and social governance in the time of COVID. So I hope you're able to join, and the invite for next week's will be sent out shortly after this.
Great. Thank you very much, Ollie. Thank you, Tim, and thank you to everyone who's attended today. We wish you a safe and warm afternoon.